My name is David Paul Kuhn, and I wrote a book called The Hardhat Riot, which was turned into a documentary film by the same name. The Hardhat Riot occurred in May of 1970. This is a tumultuous period in American history, and the riot itself would take on an importance over time, much in the same way the Stonewall riot did less than a year earlier in 1969. At the time that Stonewall occurs, which is the beginning of the gay rights movement, it was only a small story on the inside of the New York Times. The Hardhat Riot occurred at what the New Yorker effectively called the most tumultuous week or period in more than a century. And that is after years of political assassination. That is after the great tumult of 1968, the civil rights movement. So basically the events of the Hardhat Riot begin in around April 20th of 1970. Richard Nixon announces that he is going to withdraw 150,000 troops from Vietnam. Vietnam at this point is tearing America apart. But then 10 days later, after Nixon makes this announcement, he makes a second announcement, and that is that the war has been expanded into Cambodia. This leads to mass unrest on campuses and city streets nationwide. Then on May 4th, at a school few had ever heard of called Kent State in Ohio, 4 students are killed by National Guardsmen in a gradual escalation after a weekend of unrest. And that is Monday, May 4th. The unrest that took place after that was gasoline on a fire. The anti-war movement explodes as never before. And the tumult occurs throughout America, but in especially New York City, which at the time was one of the 2 centers of the American New Left. And New York City, by an accident of history, also in its downtown is remaking its skyscraper facade. This is the second skyscraper age, so to speak. And Lower Manhattan is being redone. A new skyline is arising of glass and steel, and most famously, the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. So by this accident of history, in downtown Manhattan, 2 worlds will collide. There will be thousands of blue-collar workmen who are still traditional Democratic voters, but far more likely than the college students to either have gone to Vietnam themselves, and many of the younger ones had brothers there or were recently returned, or to have kin and their kind in the war. The older men were far and away more likely to be veterans of World War II and Korea. And so you have one slice of America, what at the time was often called Middle America, but in New York City, which was still a working class city at the time, it was very much captured in Queens and in Brooklyn of that period. And so you had these really what were then called white ethnics, Irish, Italian, and Eastern Europeans, 1 to 2 generations often removed from the immigrant experience, heavily Catholic, grew up in these blue-collar hamlets of New York City. They were crowded into downtown Manhattan for the jobs, for the good work. At the same time, a mecca of protest is Federal Hall, outside Federal Hall, right beside the New York Stock Exchange. This is this very old colonial square from the original New York City, once the center of New York City activity in the colonial era. That's where George Washington was inaugurated. And it was common back then for protest, and at that time very often the anti-war movement, to come down to this square and demonstrate against the masters of finance, against the masters of war. And as they would begin to gather increasingly every single day, especially after Kent State occurs on the Monday, there's chanting is echoing off skyscrapers. 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your fucking war. And there's chants for Ho Chi Minh. There's the waving of Viet Cong flags occurring down the streets. And then at the steel perches above, where these skyscrapers are being built, you have these blue-collar workmen. And they are looking down and they are seeing Viet Cong flags They are hearing the chants for Ho Chi Minh because what is very human in politics? We remember the things that offend us, even more than the things that commend us. So these men who are disproportionately veterans are noticing the flag and the chants for those fighting their kin and kind in Vietnam. As the anti-war movement really radicalizes vociferously after the Kent State tragedy, the chants are louder, there's fires, there's bomb fires, city, university, like university buildings throughout America, the ROTC is raided. On Long Island, you have a Stony Brook, 2 buildings are set afire. This is occurring across America. Buildings are being set on fire on campuses, and of course, these men build buildings for a living. By Thursday, after the Monday of Kent State, the gradual conflicts that were occurring throughout the city, there is a demonstration on Wall Street at this square, and in many ways, it was like any other anti-war demonstration. People took to the microphone and spoke their piece. But around noon, 20 to 40 construction workers break in, and they're carrying flags, and there's a little scuffle. This little scuffle will become the trigger of a cascade of events that will lead to the Hardhat Riot the next day, what the Wall Street Journal would coin Bloody Friday. The scuffle leads to word being passed around work sites that afternoon that we need to return tomorrow and be heard. Now some people said, we need to go back and bust some heads. There's this general feeling that they want to return on Friday, whether it's violently or verbally, they want to return and make themselves felt. Because that Thursday, they were overwhelmed by the student protesters, and some of them, complained about their flags being torn away. By the afternoon, word had spread so much around construction sites that there are these peculiar phone calls after, say, 4 o'clock that are made into the NYPD, warning that the construction workers are out for blood. That morning, Friday, May 8th, there will be a few more warnings, a few more calls into the NYPD. Now, this is a time of great tumult. So the NYPD is fielding a lot of calls at this time. And what was done or not done with those warnings is impossible to trace. But we do know that the warnings came, and they also came into City Hall, and the trouble was expected because there had been this escalation of confrontations. Perhaps in a blessing, the morning was cold, much colder than expected. There was this cold rain. It really stifled turnout. But still, the fervent came, and they gathered on Wall Street. The NYPD dispatch expected Abby Hoffman to arrive. He did not show. There's the typical anti-war speeches, the typical signage. Everything about it was very typical. And then construction workers started to drip in. 5 here, 8 here, 30, 60. And it's the lunch hour on Wall Street. And roughly around noon, about 20,000 people are cramming the space between skyscrapers, listening to and watching speakers high up top Federal Hall steps speak on a microphone against the war, mostly, though at the time, because of the free speech movement, this is almost unimaginable today, they invited people who supported, whether they supported the troops or actually were hawks on the war, they were invited to come up and say their piece too. And sometimes they were booed, but they were allowed to say their piece. But generally you have a typical anti-war demonstration, but as the hard hats, as the construction workers start to gather around the periphery of this demonstration, then push into the crowd beneath the steps, the police rush to basically create, in the terms of the time, a demilitarized zone. They create a demarcation line to separate the two tribes. And on one side, you have guys in work clothes and helmets. They're bigger, calloused hands, tan from working on the high steel. And then on the steps, you have largely college students. And around noon, as best as we can understand it, as the two tribes are chanting back and forth and insulting each other, there was one student starts waving a Viet Cong flag, and as best as we understand it, that's the moment that the construction workers break the police line. And what comes to take place is chaos. Lower Manhattan will be overrun. Wall Street will be a giant panoply of violence. And even for this era of shock, in this highly polarized era, this era of bombings and political violence and constant demonstration, even more than our own, passerbys, basically witnesses who saw the worst brutality. Some of the students would be beaten unconscious. Some of the students fought back and tried to give as good as they could get. The violence will first spread around Federal Hall and around Wall Street, and then the construction workers will take the steps, they will take the high ground, and it will spread gradually uptown on smaller streets, on the small byways where the sunlight barely escapes the skyscrapers and barely cracks the skyline, to up Broadway. And the movement up Broadway will eventually take the construction workers to City Hall. And America's oldest city hall will be laid under siege. Because at the time, the mayor is John Lindsay. And John Lindsay is an icon of what will become the New Left. He is what was then a Rockefeller Republican, a liberal Republican. More to the point is that he is an example of the shift that is occurring also in the American left, because he is a man to the manner born. He exudes the old Protestant establishment of old that still retains control of sort of the American establishment. And he is also a star. He is on the cover of every magazine, Time, Life. He is an international star when he even first ran for mayor. He is on the talk shows at night. He's tall and handsome, and he shines. And so John Lindsay, who's this national political figure, is also increasingly seen as the antagonist towards this blue-collar city, because that city has experienced deindustrialization before it will hit much of America. It has experienced a crime wave before it will hit much of America. It is experiencing the new left and the tumult of the new left, perhaps unlike any city shy of maybe San Francisco. But the cultural clash and the size and scope of New York City gives everything a volume that is just so unique to Gotham. You know, it's easy to forget that this was a different New York City. After the Second World War, New York City is the largest manufacturing center in America. And so over these decades, these neighborhoods had not only experienced a dramatic increase in crime, over 100%, the crime rate rises over 100% in the 60s, but they had also experienced their fellows in their neighborhood often losing jobs, and that meant that their work was that much more valuable. Lindsay, who comes to represent to them everything that they feel is changing about America, because this is the time when liberalism is shifting from the FDR coalition of old, which of course these blue-collar workmen embody, to a new left, to a college-educated, centered politics. And it's happening not just in the political operatives, it's happening in the media. The media is changing from a trade to a profession. And it's happening, of course, with the candidate who will become the Democratic nominee 2 years later. George McGovern would write his PhD dissertation on a labor dispute, and he would understand in his head these issues, but he never could connect with the common worker of the era. And that would come to, in many ways, embody what is happening to the Democratic Party at the time. So all of this is in the air as the construction workers siege City Hall. Mayor Lindsay has lowered the flag to honor Kent State. And to these men, they felt, when they saw the flag lowered for that tragedy at Kent State, it triggered something in them, because for them, and a lot of them, again, they're disproportionately veterans, disproportionately likely to have family in Vietnam compared to the college students. For these men, they feel like the heroes of the era are, well, at the time, what was changing was that they felt that the anti-war demonstrators were being portrayed as heroes, and the soldiers fighting for their country were being portrayed as villains. And to them, it had inverted their whole world. On top of that, this is the beginning. It's only a few years old that the flag is being desecrated and burned to get across political statements writ large. It is the Vietnam era where this becomes very popular. And it is shocking for the time to see the American flag desecrated for these men, because the anti-war demonstrators, they come there that day for reasons that we all understand. They came there that day to fight what was a tragic war, to stand against the tragedy of the Vietnam War. So we know that the cause and why they feel righteous in their cause. What's less understood is that the construction workers at the time also feel like they're standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, because when that flag is desecrated, they see their comrades who died in combat. When someone dies in combat, the widow sits there and the flag is handed to the widow. Here is a flag for a life. It's not abstract to them. So they've come to that day with their own values, and that they feel like they are standing up for people who don't have a voice. At the same time, they are living like a lot of middle America at the time, and that's obviously used metaphorically. They are living with the sense that every day on TV and in the magazines, you hear about the anti-war movement and the protests against the war, but you hear very little support for the troops. Now, blue-collar America was not pro-war. Since 1968, the working class, like the majority of Americans, had turned against the war. That is, they no longer approved of the Vietnam War. And that was after, basically the trigger for that was the Tet Offensive at the end of January of 1968, when America will win a literal victory, but they will lose a PR victory. Their forces are overrun. It occurs across Vietnam. It is a shock for the public, and they start to realize maybe this war is a quagmire. And while they no longer favor the war, they struggle with how do you end a war in the best way possible. And in these grays of that day came out the bright colors of polarized America. And basically Lower Manhattan will be overrun in a clash between blue-collar workers largely and college protesters. And this moment, the Hardhat Riot, will come to capture the beginning of when the Democratic Party is losing and begins to lose the working class. It is in this era when the Republican Party, through Richard Nixon, begins to move the Republican Party from blue bloods to blue collars. Richard Nixon will be at the lowest point of his presidency by the end of that week. The Hardhat Riot occurs on May 8th. That night is this famous NBA basketball game where the Knicks will defeat the Lakers and win their first NBA championship, which will delay a very famous press conference for Richard Nixon after this tumultuous week. And that night, after the Knicks game ends, he goes before the reporters, and nearly every question is about the unrest and, of course, the tragedy of Kent State. And he will stay up almost the entire night, barely sleep, and it's the next pre-dawn light, the morning after, when Richard Nixon will go to the Capitol and stand before the Colossus of Abraham Lincoln and never feel so small and unpresidential. What happens with the riot is suddenly the energy shifts. By that Sunday, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, writes in his diary about the riot, and he starts to feel like maybe there are some people who are going into the streets for them. Now, the construction workers weren't taken to the streets for Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon was never one to shy away from a political opportunity. And so in the Venn diagram, he found the common ground. And as in the weeks after the riot, New York City will trigger weeks of demonstrations of blue-collar workers, teamsters, tradesmen, longshoremen, and also Wall Street workers will come out. A lot of them were not necessarily you know, they were the clerks. And a lot of the clerks also came from blue collar neighborhoods. But you do have businessmen showing up. And so you have the beginnings of this interesting new coalition of Wall Street men, of businessmen and workmen, uniting, chanting for the US of A. And there's generally a feeling in the streets in New York City that that they are counter to the counterculture. And day after day, day in and day out, there will be these protests, these marches in New York City that were just statements of support for the soldiers in Vietnam. That no matter how bad the war is, they want to support the goodness in the boys who are over there fighting this terrible war. And then by May 20th, there will be a day that Time magazine will coin Workers' Woodstock. 150,000 tradesmen, Teamsters, longshoremen, and representatives of the working class throughout New York City, labor secretaries, crowd into Lower Manhattan. And you have this very unique phenomenon. You have a day of massive flag waving in support of troops at a time when veterans felt, some veterans were told to even not wear their uniforms when they landed in the United States because they felt like they were forced to shoulder the burden of the bad war, even though, of course, they had no say in who fought it. And this is what is also occurring at the time. There is a class war beneath the Vietnam War, that for as much has been told about the Vietnam War, for all the documentaries and films and books, this is still tremendously under-discussed. That no time since the Civil War had more been asked of those with less. And this legalized class tragedy would make it a personal war to some of these men who felt that they were the ones doing the fighting and dying, and that it was college students, not of course not the majority of protesters, but like any movement on the left or the right, we always remember those that again most offend you. And they would feel like that here were these certain college students, activists, who are standing on their high horse, lecturing them about social justice, even as they stood within the safety and sanctuary of their campus, with no literal blood in the game. And this class and cultural war will be condensed into a microcosm that is the Hardhat Riot. And this time when the FDR coalition first fractures. And we are living with that, of course, today, as these first inroads will lead to the Reagan Democrat, and eventually that Reagan Democrat will lead to in broad terms, the Trump Republican.